There is a kind of disappearing that does not come with an ending. No final conversation, no moment where everything falls apart or gets said out loud, but instead unfolds so quietly that even you may not notice it at first. Because nothing seems broken, nothing is officially over, and yet something in the way you exist within other people's lives has begun to soften, thin out, and slowly recede. There is no breakup to point to, no argument to replay in your mind, and no clear reason you can offer when you sense the distance growing. Because the shift does not arrive through conflict or rejection, but through a series of small, almost unremarkable changes, such as replying a little later than you used to, feeling less inclined to reach out, or realizing that your presence no longer feels essential in the way it once did. You may still care, still wish people well, and still feel a quiet affection for the connections that once mattered deeply. Yet you begin to notice that you are no longer occupying the same emotional space in their lives. Not because anyone pushed you away, but because you slowly stopped placing yourself at the center of interactions that required more energy than they returned. This kind of disappearance is subtle enough that it often goes unnoticed by others. Because from the outside, you are still there, still polite, still responsive when needed, but inside, you sense that something has shifted, as though the version of you that once showed up fully, consistently, and without hesitation has stepped back, choosing presence in smaller, quieter doses. There comes a moment when you realize that you are no longer the first person people think to call. No longer the one who fills the silence, smooths the tension, or keeps the connection alive through effort alone. And while this realization does not arrive with pain sharp enough to name, it carries a weight that settles slowly, leaving you aware of how gently you have faded from certain spaces. You might notice this awareness during ordinary moments, such as scrolling through messages that feel less frequent, recognizing that invitations no longer come as often, or sensing that conversations have grown more functional than intimate. And in these moments, you may not feel angry or resentful, but quietly reflective, as you begin to understand that your presence has become lighter, less central, and easier to overlook. What makes this experience difficult to articulate is that there is no one to blame and nothing to fix. Because no rules were broken and no lines were crossed, yet you feel yourself becoming less visible, less involved, and less emotionally embedded in the lives of people you once felt closely connected to. You may begin to recognize that you are slowly disappearing not only from others' lives, but from the role you once played within them, a role that may have required you to be constantly available, emotionally attuned, or quietly dependable. And as that role loosens its hold on you, your absence becomes more noticeable to yourself than it is to anyone else. This realization can feel disorienting, because it asks you to sit with a truth that is neither dramatic nor dismissible, which is that sometimes people do not leave each other through conflict, but through gradual shifts in presence, attention, and emotional investment that happen quietly, over time. And as you begin to see this pattern clearly, you may find yourself wondering not what went wrong, but when the disappearance began, and whether it started as a choice, a necessity, or simply a natural response to something within you that no longer knew how to stay the same. When you begin to notice yourself slowly stepping back from people's lives, it can be tempting to assume that something inside you has hardened, that you have become colder, less caring, or more detached than you once were. Yet in most cases, this quiet disappearance does not come from indifference or a lack of love, but from a deep and accumulating fatigue that has little to do with the people themselves and much more to do with the roles you have been carrying for far too long. You may still feel warmth, empathy, and concern for others, and you may still wish them well in ways that are sincere and genuine. Yet the energy required to maintain the version of yourself that once showed up effortlessly now feels heavier, more deliberate, and less sustainable, as if every interaction asks you to step back into a familiar shape that no longer fits who you are becoming. This is not the withdrawal of someone who has stopped caring, but the response of someone who has been caring in ways that required constant adjustment, emotional monitoring, and self-silencing, often without realizing how much of themselves was being set aside in order to keep connections smooth, stable, and free of tension. Over time, the effort of maintaining these roles accumulates quietly, especially when you have been the listener, the mediator, the dependable one, or the emotionally available presence in other people's lives, because these roles rarely come with clear boundaries or moments of rest, and instead rely on your continued willingness to adapt, accommodate, and stay consistent, even when your inner landscape begins to change. As your inner world shifts, the roles you once inhabited with ease can start to feel restrictive, as though returning to them requires you to ignore your own needs, minimize your evolving perspectives, or suppress parts of yourself that have grown more sensitive, reflective, or aware. And this internal conflict can create a subtle tension that makes presence feel more like performance than connection. In this context, disappearing becomes less of a decision and more of a reflex, a natural response of your nervous system seeking relief from patterns that have become too demanding to sustain. Because when emotional labor goes unacknowledged or unbalanced for long enough, distance begins to feel like the only place where your inner state can finally rest. It is important to recognize that this kind of withdrawal is not an act of rejection or punishment, but a form of self-preservation that emerges when staying present requires you to repeatedly override your own signals of fatigue, discomfort, or misalignment, until your system quietly chooses absence as the gentlest option available. You may notice that you are not angry when you step back, nor are you resentful, but simply tired in a way that cannot be resolved through sleep or time off alone. Because the exhaustion comes from having lived too long in relational dynamics that no longer reflect your internal truth. This realization can be confusing, especially if you pride yourself on being compassionate, loyal, and emotionally engaged, because acknowledging your need to withdraw may feel like a betrayal of those values, when in fact it may be the first time you are allowing them to include yourself. As you reflect on this process, it can be helpful to consider that disappearing does not mean you have failed at connection, but that your relationship with presence itself is evolving, moving away from obligation and toward authenticity, even if that transition feels uncertain or unfamiliar. And while others may not immediately understand your distance, and may interpret it through their own expectations or assumptions, your experience remains valid, because not all forms of care are visible. And sometimes the most honest expression of self-respect is the quiet choice to step back before resentment has a chance to take root. There is a particular kind of weariness that does not come from one painful moment or a single misunderstanding, but from many small instances of being partially seen, partially heard, and quietly misinterpreted, moments so ordinary and subtle that they rarely stand out on their own, yet over time begin to settle into the body as a familiar sense of emotional fatigue. These moments often arrive without drama, such as when you try to explain how you feel and are met with reassurance instead of understanding. when your concerns are quickly reframed as overthinking, or when your need for space is interpreted as distance rather than care. And while each interaction may seem harmless in isolation, their repetition slowly teaches you that being fully understood requires more effort than it should. You may find yourself revisiting the same explanations again and again, choosing your words carefully, softening your tone, and adjusting your message in the hope that this time it will land differently. Only to realize that the essence of what you are trying to express continues to be missed. Not because others are unwilling to listen, but because the language of your inner world no longer aligns with the frameworks they use to interpret it. Over time, this pattern can create an internal tension where you begin to anticipate misunderstanding before it happens, prompting you to preemptively edit yourself, simplify your emotions, or withhold parts of your experience in order to avoid the exhaustion of having to clarify, justify, or defend what feels natural and valid to you. There is a quiet erosion that occurs when you repeatedly feel like the one who must bend, compromise, or absorb discomfort in order to keep relationships smooth, especially when you notice that the effort to adapt rarely flows in both directions, leaving you with the sense that your role is to accommodate rather than to be met. This accumulation of small concessions can be difficult to name, because none of them feel significant enough to warrant confrontation. Yet together they form a pattern in which your needs are consistently deferred. Your perspective is subtly minimized, and your emotional reality is treated as something that must be managed rather than honored. As this pattern continues, you may begin to feel a growing reluctance to share openly, not because you no longer have anything to say, but because the cost of being misunderstood has become too high, and the process of explaining yourself yet again feels heavier than the relief of staying quiet. There is also a sense of loneliness that emerges within connection itself. A feeling that you are present physically or conversationally, yet emotionally unseen, as though you are translating your inner experience into a language that others can only partially grasp, leaving you with the impression that something essential is always being lost in the exchange. This loneliness does not necessarily lead to anger or resentment, but rather to a gradual withdrawal of energy, where you begin to invest less, share less, and expect less, not as a strategy, but as a natural response to having learned that full expression often leads to partial recognition at best. In this way, disappearing becomes the cumulative result of many small moments where you chose understanding over expression, harmony over honesty, and accommodation over assertion, until one day you realize that you have been quietly stepping back for a long time. Not because you wanted to leave, but because you no longer knew how to stay without diminishing yourself. And as you sit with this realization, you may begin to see that your disappearance is not sudden or unexplained, but the gentle outcome of a long history of adjusting, explaining, and yielding, a history that has shaped your relationship with connection in ways that only now are becoming clear. At a certain point, what looks like withdrawal from the outside begins to feel like regulation on the inside. Because stepping back is no longer about avoiding people or situations, but about allowing the nervous system to recover from the constant vigilance that comes with staying emotionally available in spaces where understanding has been inconsistent or conditional. Distance, in this sense, becomes less of a barrier and more of a boundary, creating a quiet buffer where your inner world can finally settle, breathe, and recalibrate after spending so much time scanning conversations, anticipating reactions, and managing the emotional atmosphere around you in order to keep everything running smoothly. When you reduce your presence, You may notice an unexpected sense of relief. Not because you enjoy absence, but because fewer interactions mean fewer moments of self-editing, fewer explanations that lead nowhere, and fewer situations where your authenticity feels compromised by the need to maintain harmony at all costs. This shift often brings with it a deeper honesty, because while you may be showing up less frequently, the moments when you do choose to engage carry more intention, clarity, and truth, as if distance has allowed you to reconnect with what actually matters to you, rather than what is expected of you. It is important to understand that this form of retreat is not a punishment directed toward others, nor is it a silent message meant to create guilt or provoke response, but simply an inward movement that prioritizes self-preservation over self-sacrifice. Especially when past patterns have taught you that constant availability comes at the expense of inner stability. As you give yourself permission to step back, you may begin to notice how much of your energy was previously devoted to maintaining emotional equilibrium for others, and how little was left to tend to your own needs. A realization that can feel both liberating and unsettling as you adjust to this new distribution of care. The space created by distance allows your nervous system to shift out of a state of low-grade alertness, where every interaction feels like a subtle demand, and into a rhythm that supports rest, reflection, and a more grounded sense of self, making it easier to discern which connections feel nourishing and which ones quietly deplete you. In this quieter state, presence becomes more selective and more sincere, because you are no longer showing up out of habit, obligation, or fear of disappointing others, but from a place of choice that honors your limits and respects your evolving capacity for connection. This does not mean that you have stopped caring or that you have closed yourself off emotionally, but rather that you are learning to care in ways that do not require you to abandon yourself. Recognizing that true connection cannot be sustained through constant self-erasure. By reframing withdrawal as a form of self-protection, you allow yourself to see disappearance not as a failure or a flaw, but as a necessary pause, one that creates the conditions for healthier engagement in the future, whether with others or with yourself. And in this pause, you may come to understand that protecting your inner balance is not an act of selfishness, but a prerequisite for any connection that hopes to be genuine, mutual, and grounded in respect, even if that understanding takes time to fully settle. Even when stepping back brings a sense of relief and protection, there is often an undercurrent of quiet sadness that accompanies this disappearance. Because withdrawing from others does not erase the memories of connection that once felt meaningful, nor does it negate the longing for being seen, understood, and met in ways that once seemed possible. You may find yourself remembering moments of closeness that felt genuine at the time, conversations that flowed easily, laughter that carried warmth, and a sense of familiarity that once made presence feel natural rather than effortful. And these memories can surface unexpectedly, not to pull you back, but to remind you of what you hoped those connections could become. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing that the issue was never a lack of care, but a growing inability to be understood within the dynamics that existed. A recognition that despite your patience, your explanations, and your willingness to adapt, something essential about you remained unseen or unacknowledged. This grief is often complicated by the absence of a clear ending, because there was no dramatic rupture to justify the sadness, no definitive moment where everything broke, leaving you to hold a loss that feels intangible, yet deeply personal, as you come to terms with the quiet truth that certain relationships could not evolve alongside you. As you reflect on this loss, you may notice that the sadness is not rooted in anger or regret, but in the acceptance that being understood requires more than proximity or history, and that some connections, no matter how long they lasted or how meaningful they once felt, were shaped by conditions that no longer align with who you are becoming. There is also a sense of tenderness in this acceptance, because acknowledging that a relationship cannot continue in the same way means honoring both what it gave you and what it could not, without needing to assign blame or rewrite the past to justify your distance. You may feel a quiet ache when you realize that you are no longer sharing the parts of yourself that have grown the most. Not because you wish to withhold them, but because you understand that sharing requires a level of receptivity that is no longer present. And offering your inner world without that receptivity would only deepen the sense of being unseen. This kind of sadness does not demand resolution or closure, because it is not something to be fixed, but something to be felt, allowed, and gently integrated as part of your emotional landscape, reminding you that letting go can coexist with care. Over time, this acceptance can bring a subtle peace, not because the loss disappears, but because you stop resisting the reality that not every connection is meant to accompany you through every phase of your life, and that parting ways does not diminish the value of what once existed. In acknowledging this truth, you give yourself permission to mourn without judgment, to remember without attachment, and to move forward without the burden of forcing continuity where natural separation has already begun to take place. And in this space of quiet mourning, you may find that the sadness itself becomes a sign of your capacity to feel deeply, to value connection sincerely, and to honor the complexity of relationships that shape you, even as you allow them to fall away. As this reflection comes to a close, it may be helpful to remember that disappearing does not always mean leaving for good. Nor does it imply that something has gone wrong beyond repair, but rather that a quiet recalibration has taken place, one in which your relationship with presence, connection, and self-respect has begun to shift in ways that cannot be rushed or neatly defined. What you have been listening to is not an explanation meant to label your experience, nor an answer designed to tell you what to do next, but an invitation to notice how gently and naturally certain changes unfold when your inner world begins to ask for more space, honesty, and care than it once did. If you recognize yourself in this process, you do not need to make any immediate decisions, repair any relationships, or justify your distance, because sometimes the most meaningful transformation happens not through action, but through quiet awareness and the permission to acknowledge what is true for you right now. This reflection is offered simply as a mirror, one that allows you to see your experience with a little more clarity and compassion, without the pressure to draw conclusions or assign meaning before you are ready. This content is for educational and reflective purposes only. It is based on real-life experiences and personal growth journeys, shared to invite awareness, not conclusions. We encourage kind, respectful discussion and constructive comments. You are welcome to take from this space whatever resonates, and to leave the rest behind, trusting that understanding unfolds at its own pace, and that your path does not need to look like anyone else's in order to be valid. As you sit with these thoughts, you may begin to sense that disappearance is not an end point, but a pause, a threshold between old patterns and new ways of relating, where distance is not about rejection, but about creating enough room to breathe, listen, and return to yourself. And in that space, another question often arises naturally, one that does not seek immediate answers, but invites deeper reflection. which is what happens when distance begins to feel safer than connection. When solitude feels more regulating than closeness. And when stepping back feels less like avoidance and more like care. In the next reflection, we will explore this experience more closely, gently turning toward the moment when distance feels safer than connection, not to define it or resolve it, but to understand what it may be protecting, and what it might be asking for beneath the surface. If you choose to continue, you are invited to stay with that question, allowing it to unfold slowly, without urgency or expectation, as we move into the next chapter, when distance feels safer than connection.